Many of you have undoubtedly played Dark Souls, and all of you have most likely at least heard of it. And with good reason. Due to Hidataka Miyazaki's genius, Dark Souls has become one of the most critically acclaimed video games in recent times. But do you think Miyazaki just pulled all this out of his ass one day? No, of course not. Which brings me to my real point. The truth that most people don't know about Dark Souls is that it is actually one of the most faithful adaptations and/or remakes of Franklin's Lost Expedition of 1845 that baffled Victorian Britain with its disappearance. When you first take a look at it, you would think me completely crazy. For what does a medieval fantasy game have in common with a failed British expedition of the Victorian era? Well, turns out, quite a lot. For when you take a closer look, the resemblance starts to become uncanny. That's why I'll go through every major part of the game to prove how Miyazaki is just as uncreative and talentless as the rest of us. Number 1. The world. One of the things Dark Souls is best known for, besides its difficulty, is how the world is portrayed and how the story is told through it. The story has been notoriously difficult to understand unless you have read every single item description or viewed a ton of YouTube videos about it. Now, if you know anything about the Franklin expedition, it's that there are very few things we know for certain, having only one document to go on, and having to study items found in the Arctic to know where the crews went and get any idea of what they did. And any accounts from the Inuit we might get are undocumented, so you can't take anything they say as fact either. For example, we know the crew headed south towards Backsfish River with boat sledges to get to the nearest British trading post after the ships had been frozen in the ice. But how many crew members and how many different parties split up, we don't know. We only have an idea based on what we've found. Comparatively, in Dark Souls, you don't know much about the details of the world either. You know the kingdom you're in is called Lordran, and that it was once ruled by Lord Gwyn, who has since sacrificed himself to prolong the Age of Fire. But beside what you learned in the opening cutscene, you have to rely on item descriptions you find scattered around the world to tell the story, or just the environment itself. See the similarities yet? The one clear document followed by a mystery full of clues? Yeah. Now what's funny is that in both cases you rely on other people to piece the clues together for you, whether that be Batividya or Russell Potter. Number 2. The characters. Another similarity between the Franklin expedition and Dark Souls is the characters, or human beings if you so please. In both, we know almost nothing about most people we see, whether they be hollows in Dark Souls or the crew of the Erebus and the Terror. The people we actually know something about are few and far between. Let's compare and contrast some of them. Sigmire of Katarina, Sir John Franklin. The Franklin expedition gets its name from Sir John Franklin, the leader of the expedition and captain of one of the two ships. He was a fat, well-standing man from his home country of Britain that ventured far into the Arctic only to meet disaster. He was very charismatic, leading many to enjoy his presence. And at first glance, he might seem very well suited to lead the expedition, having led previous Arctic expeditions in the north of Canada. But it turns out he was less well suited than originally assumed, which helps cause disaster for the expedition. After his disappearance, his now widowed wife would cling on to any last hope of her husband's survival, but to no avail, clearly swallowed by grief. This lines up almost perfectly with one specific character from Dark Souls, Sigmire of Katarina. Like Franklin, he was a well-standing man from his own country, in this case, a knight, which has now ventured far into a far-off land, only to meet disaster once there, needing to be saved by the player character multiple times. His charisma swayed many characters to enjoy both him and his descendants' company. Like Franklin, this proves he was more ill-suited for what he himself calls his final adventure than it may seem based on his status and previous doings. Sigmire's story ends in tragedy whatever the player does. Either he dies, or becomes hollow, having lost all purpose and honor. Like John and his wife Jane Franklin, Sigmire also has a family member that misses him, and can't stop thinking about him while he is out adventuring, in this case it being his daughter, since his wife had already died. I guess you could say he is indeed in quite the pickle. Solera of Astora, Francis Crozier. The second in command of the Franklin expedition, Francis Crozier was perhaps the most experienced polar veteran of the day. He went on the expedition even though he didn't really have to, and was arguably a better choice for commander of the expedition than the actual leader, Sir John Franklin, was. During the expedition, he motivated the men to strive down south and begin their death march to civilization, of which none would survive. In the same way, the game's most popular character, Solera of Astora, is perhaps one of the greatest warriors in the world, and goes on to adventure in Lordran, not because of being forced to, but because he just wants to do so even though he doesn't need to. He is arguably better suited for the game than the main character, at least at the start. He has also motivated tons of players to continue on in the game, where most people will die a whole lot of deaths. Patches? James Fitzjames. This one's really just for them both having stupid names and actively sabotaging the journey they're involved with. Patches by kicking you down a hole to die, and Fitzjames really just for choosing his war buddies from the tropics rather than choosing polar veterans for the crew. I think this should be enough proof to convince you that Miyazaki completely ripped his characters off from the Franklin expedition. Number 3. The bosses. In Dark Souls, the bosses may seem creative at first, but here once again, they're actually all just shallow rip-offs of the Franklin expedition. You might be wondering how all this is possible, seeing as real-life historical events don't really have bosses like video games do. Well, you see, the bosses in Dark Souls represent more major aspects of the Franklin expedition more than anything else. Let's storm through a few and let me explain. Ornstein and Smough, cannibalism. Ornstein and Smough quite clearly represents the cannibalism the crew practiced after they ran out of good food and realized most of the other food they had was slowly killing them. Smough is very fat because he's a cannibal and eats a lot of people. When you take this into context with the rest of what I've said, it will become quite obvious where Miyazaki got the inspiration for this from. The infamous difficulty of the boss fight is supposed to showcase how hard it was for the crew to devour their fellow man. Not that Smough would complain though, the fat bastard. Nito, the bone remnants. One of the traces of the expedition we can find on King William Island is the remains of the bones from the crew members that died there. Nito is the Gravelord and can therefore control the skeletons in his arena. But isn't there something familiar about this arena? Oh! Gaping dragon, lead poisoning and scurvy. You see, the name and design of the Gaping Dragon is actually based on the fact that the Franklin expedition suffered from heavy lead poisoning and scurvy. Lead poisoning opening old wounds, and scurvy making these wounds almost unable to heal. The result was gaping wounds on most of the crew, if not all of the crew by the end of their days. The Gaping Dragon is a perfect representation of this. Well, maybe except for all the teeth in its mouth. Number 4. The sequels. Dark Souls has since the release of the original game become a proper game series with multiple installments, a spiritual predecessor, and spin-offs. This is very much like how the Franklin expedition had its own spiritual predecessor in the Coppermine expedition of 1819, where Sir John Franklin also led his men to almost certain death in a death march. Over half his crew ended up dying, and Franklin even had to eat his own boots in order to survive. The survivors only returned with their lives after being rescued in 1822. This, of course, corresponds to Demon Souls, almost like a test version of what would later be perfected and become hugely popular. And as the Soul series has Bloodborne as a major spin-off that was released quite a while after the original game's initial success, so too does the Franklin expedition have Roald Amundson's expedition through the Northwest Passage. The first successful voyage through the Northwest Passage garnered much fame and quite the sum of money in return. Like Bloodborne became one of the most critically acclaimed games in the series, even rivaling Dark Souls itself, and making a lot of money in the process. Number 5. The difficulty. Do I really need to explain this one? Surviving in the world of Dark Souls is supposed to be hard, but becomes easier once you learn the mechanics of the game. Oh yeah, real clever with that one, Miyazaki. I wonder where he got that from. So in conclusion, the Souls series owes most of its fame and success to Franklin's Lost Expedition, and Miyazaki is a hack for so shamelessly ripping it off. I mean, it would have been fine if he had at least credited it as a massive inspiration, much less his magnum opus being a complete remake of it, but no, he just couldn't fucking be bothered. Fuck you, Miyazaki, and everything you stand for. Without people like you, the world wouldn't be such horrible as it is now, would it? How disgusting.
Ba 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 踊る赤ちゃん人間